13 July 1943. The troop train shuddered and hissed as it clawed west across the Kansas prairie. Lieutenant Carl Weber pressed his forehead against the soot-grimed window and saw nothing but wheat, an endless, rippling ocean of gold that shimmered beneath a sky so wide it seemed to have no edge. The smell of hot creosote from the railroad ties drifted through the half-open window, mixing with the dry, grassy scent of midsummer. He had left the dust and chaos of Tunisia barely 8 weeks before, captured with thousands of other Afrika Korps soldiers in the final collapse of the Axis position there. On 13 May 1943, the surrender of roughly 267,000 Axis troops had ended the North African campaign, and he, like so many others, had boarded an American transport under armed guard, expecting a grim exile. He remembered the blinding North African sun, the clatter of retreating panzers, the hiss of British 25-pounder shells. The Afrika Korps had fought like veterans to the end, but by early May, the desert supply lines were strangled. German officers spoke of secret weapons and of a coming reversal in Europe, but the capture was complete. Now, rumbling through the heart of America, Weber wondered if those promises had been nothing more than campfire smoke. Outside, Kansas rolled past in waves of abundance. Farmhouses sat proud against the horizon, their white paint unscarred by war. New granaries and gasoline-powered combines dotted the fields, machines whose scale dwarfed anything Weber had seen in war-torn Europe. Even the smell of the prairie, sun-warmed wheat, and the faint tang of oil from the harvesters spoke of resources Germany could no longer imagine. Opposite him in the carriage, Sergeant Evelyn Evie Carter of the 312th Military Police Escort Guard Company sat with an easy but alert posture, her M1 carbine resting across her knees. She watched the prisoners with professional calm. To her, the sight of these once formidable Germans, still crisp in bearing, was a daily reminder of the distance between propaganda and reality. As dusk fell, a sudden thunderhead climbed the sky, black and roiling, throwing spears of lightning across the horizon. Weber flinched at the crack of thunder, a sound that echoed distant artillery. Yet there was no fear here, only the restless power of nature and the quiet strength of a nation that could ship its enemies halfway across the world while building victory at a pace that defied reason. He turned from the window, the storm's first drops streaking the glass. For the first time since capture, he felt a flicker of uncertainty, not about his own fate, but about everything he had believed about Germany's chances. The train rattled on toward Concordia, carrying him deeper into a land whose sheer scale would soon force him to reconsider the meaning of power. The train braked hard at dawn, wheels screeching against the rails as the prisoners glimpsed their new world. Camp Concordia spread across 640 acres of Kansas earth, a fresh grid of 300 wooden barracks and guard towers crowned with new barbed wire that glittered like a morning frost. Diesel fumes from idling army trucks mingled with the prairie air. The compound looked hastily built, yet meticulously planned, a testament to the organizational machine that had already ferried hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers across the Atlantic. Carl Weber stepped onto the platform beneath a sun that promised another 90-degree day. His boots sank slightly into the baked earth. Around him, members of the 312th Military Police Escort Guard Company directed the column with clipped commands, their khaki uniforms unruffled despite the heat. Sergeant Evelyn Carter's voice cut through the bustle, steady and unyielding, and the line of prisoners moved toward the processing sheds. Inside, U.S. clerks cataloged each man with efficient precision: name, rank, Afrika Korps unit, serial number. From the supply tables came blue denim fatigues, World War I surplus, dyed and boldly stenciled with PW in white paint across the back, sleeves, and pant legs. The mark left no doubt of their status. Weber ran his fingers across the stiff fabric and caught the faint smell of indigo dye. Nearby, Corporal Franz Müller scowled, his voice a low growl in German. "They parade us like cattle," he muttered, rallying a cluster of younger prisoners with hardline Nazi rhetoric. His pride was unbroken. He called the guards farm boys playing soldier. Weber heard the defiance and felt its familiar pull, but the clean efficiency of the American operation gave him pause. A clerk explained, without boast, that by Geneva Convention rule, the prisoners would receive rations equal to those of U.S. depot troops and earn 80 cents a day in scrip for canteen goods. In ration-starved Europe, such generosity would have been unthinkable. Weber caught Mueller's quick, suspicious glance, as if the very notion of American fairness were a provocation. Outside, the early sun burned off the last traces of dawn haze. The clang of the camp gate closing rang like a clear bell over the prairie. Weber glanced back at the rails disappearing east, then at the ordered rows of barracks ahead. The United States had captured him twice, once in Tunisia by force of arms, and now, quietly, by a display of organization and abundance he could not dismiss. The electric lights of the guard towers blinked on as the morning brightened, a subtle promise that this land possessed a power deeper than mere weapons. The first Kansas dawn inside the wire came with the scent of wheat and the low drone of cicadas. Carl Weber rose to the sound of boots on gravel as the work details formed. The humidity clung to his skin, thicker and heavier than the Sahara air he had known in Tunisia. A guard's shout, sharp but not cruel, sent the first squad through the double gate. Beyond the perimeter fence, the prairie rolled away like a golden sea, and at its edge a battered pickup truck waited, dust settling behind its fenders. Jack Thompson, the farmer who had volunteered to hire prisoner labor, tipped his sweat-stained hat to Sergeant Evelyn Carter. 10 years earlier, during the black years of the Dust Bowl, his family had nearly lost everything. Now he stood on land green and heavy with grain, the air rich with the smell of cut straw. Wartime demand had turned Kansas into the nation's breadbasket again. Wheat yields were climbing toward record totals, and government quotas promised prices that kept tractors running and silos full. Thompson knew he needed every able hand to bring in the crop. Weber climbed into the truck bed with 5 other Germans. The engine coughed and rattled, smelling of hot oil and dust. As the truck jolted down the dirt road, he watched the guard towers recede, each topped with the sharp silhouette of an M1 Garand. Yet it wasn't the rifles that impressed him. It was the scale of the farms, each field a square mile or more, punctuated by grain elevators rising like concrete castles. He remembered Berlin bread lines and the thin wartime rations of his family. Here, the fields seemed limitless. At the edge of Thompson's land, a steel combine thundered to life. Its wide header devoured stalks by the ton, and a belt-driven auger spilled wheat into waiting wagons with the roar of a small engine. Thompson explained that with gasoline rationed for civilians, the Department of Agriculture had secured fuel for the harvest. Even with millions of men overseas, America's mechanization meant the crop would not rot in the field. Weber thought of the hand scythes his grandparents once used in Bavaria and felt a flicker of disbelief. The work was hard and honest. The humid air smelled of diesel and cut grain. Chaff stuck to the sweat on his neck like gold dust. Thompson's young son trotted out with a jug of cold well water and shyly offered each prisoner a tin cup. The boy's small kindness, uncoached and unguarded, caught Weber off balance. As the sun slid toward noon, Weber paused to wipe the sweat from his brow. He tasted wheat dust on his lips, not the acrid sand of North Africa, but the sweet earthiness of American plenty. For the first time, he felt the prairie's quiet power, a strength not of armies, but of a people who could feed the world while fighting a global war. Night settled over Camp Concordia, with the chirp of crickets and the hum of a generator powering the guard tower lights. The next morning, Weber noticed a new posting on the camp bulletin board. Prisoner of War University. Fall session. The neat block letters listed classes in English, mathematics, and engineering. Visiting instructors from the University of Kansas would teach, and textbooks were already stacked in the camp library. He read the notice twice. In Berlin, schooling was a privilege of the regime. Here, even enemies were offered education. A few prisoners laughed and shrugged it off as American propaganda. Corporal Franz Müller, ever the loyal Nazi, scoffed openly. "Why learn the enemy's tongue? We will go home victorious," he declared, though the words sounded thin. Curiosity drew Weber to the camp library that afternoon. The room smelled faintly of old paper and coal smoke from the potbelly stove. Rows of English primers lay beside volumes of engineering diagrams and agricultural manuals. A thin American sergeant explained the courses, his voice casual, as though offering evening recreation instead of a subtle campaign of re-education. Weber opened a primer and traced the unfamiliar letters. He thought of his father, who had once admired German technical mastery, and wondered what he would make of a nation that built airplanes and Liberty ships by the thousand and still found time to teach its prisoners. The figures were whispered around the barracks. More than 2,710 Liberty ships launched already, 2 a day, each capable of carrying over 10,000 tons of cargo. No U-boat fleet could sink them fast enough. Outside, the prairie wind carried the smell of cut wheat and the metallic tang of the barbed wire fence. In the distance, a freight train's whistle cut through the evening, another convoy of American abundance rolling east toward the Atlantic. Weber felt the slow turning of his own thoughts. This education was not only a courtesy, it was a quiet display of confidence, the assurance of a nation so secure in its strength that it could afford to teach its captives. That night, he lay on his bunk, listening to the steady pulse of the generator. The hum seemed to echo the rhythmic production of the factories he imagined far away: shipyards, aircraft plants, truck lines, an unending heartbeat of a democracy at war. He turned the English primer in his hands and thought that perhaps this language was worth learning, if only to understand the people who could fight so fiercely and yet offer their enemies a future beyond barbed wire. The Kansas sun burned high and white, flattening the shadows of the guard towers until they seemed to float above the dust. On the recreation field, a group of prisoners knelt with buckets in hand, each filled not with chalk, but with the fine white dust of surplus flour from the camp bakery. Weber watched as a thin POW with rolled sleeves shook the flour through his fingers, sketching crisp boundaries for the soccer pitch. The powder caught in the breeze like smoke. To men who had stood in ration lines back in Europe, flour was bread, life itself. Here it marked the out-of-bounds line for a game. Children from neighboring farms clustered along the fence, wide-eyed, trading gum with prisoners who offered shy smiles. The exchange was wordless but easy, the sweet scent of spearmint riding the warm prairie air. Evie Carter leaned on her carbine and shook her head in quiet amusement. She had spent the morning supervising the canteen, where POWs bought cigarettes and pencils with their 80-cent daily scrip, their pay equal to that of American depot troops. Weber crouched and sifted a pinch of flour through his own fingers, the grains soft as powdered snow. He thought of his mother in Hamburg, who had written of bread rations shrinking each month, and of the darkened kitchens where families stretched every crumb. Here, the Americans treated flour as if it were chalk, so plentiful that a game could waste what Europe hungered for. The field came alive with shouts as the teams kicked off. Boots thudded against the rough Kansas soil. The ball skidded across white lines that glowed in the afternoon light. Evie noted how the prisoners, once stiff with pride, now laughed like schoolboys. Even Franz Müller, usually tight with scorn, joined the fray. A freight train wailed across the prairie, its long string of boxcars carrying grain eastward toward Atlantic ports. The sound lingered like a distant horn of triumph, a reminder of the immense agricultural engine that fed not just America, but Allied armies across 2 oceans. In Washington, production figures spoke of surpluses measured in millions of bushels. To Weber, the statistics seemed impossible. A nation able to waste flour and still fill the holds of ships, more than 2,710 Liberty ships by mid-1943, each carrying enough cargo to feed a continent. When the game ended, Weber rubbed the last of the flour from his hands. He felt a quiet awe at a people who could fight a world war and still have enough to draw their games in bread dust. As the sun slid west, the white touchlines glowed like a message. Here, abundance itself was a weapon. Evening brought a hush to the camp, broken only by the rasp of crickets and the low murmur of a field radio in the guardhouse. Weber lingered near the fence where Evie Carter's patrol passed. From the radio came a calm American voice reciting the day's production tallies. More Liberty ships launched, another wave of aircraft from Boeing's Seattle plant, new tank brigades forming for Europe. A guard, checking his watch, remarked that the United States had already built more than 2.38 million military trucks and was turning out 286,000 aircraft, numbers so large Weber at first thought he had misheard. 2 Liberty ships a day slid down the ways at American shipyards, their steel hulls dwarfing the capacity of the entire Kriegsmarine. The guard spoke without bravado, as though these feats were simply the natural order of things. Weber felt the weight of those figures settle like a physical pressure. He remembered the fuel shortages in Tunisia, the desperate scrounging for spare parts, the nights when a single functioning half-track seemed a miracle. In contrast, here was a nation that replaced entire convoys before the paint dried on yesterday's hulls. Across the compound, Muller listened too, his jaw tight. "American lies," he muttered in German, but there was no conviction in his voice. Even he could see the truth in the endless trains that passed the camp, boxcars rumbling with grain and munitions. Evie Carter noted the shift in the prisoner's posture, the quiet recognition that no battlefield tactic could outpace such arithmetic. She had heard her father, a mechanic back home, marvel at the Willow Run plant in Michigan, where a B-24 bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes. It was an impossible statistic, yet as solid as the guard tower beneath her boots. The prairie sky deepened to indigo, stars burning cold and clear. Weber stared upward, the radio's litany of numbers echoing in his mind. Tanks, planes, ships, each figure a nail in the coffin of the Reich's ambitions. He understood then that Germany's defeat would not come from some climactic battle, but from the relentless pulse of American industry, a force as steady and inescapable as the heartbeat of the earth beneath him. A freight train's whistle keened in the distance, carrying east another load of wheat toward the Atlantic. Weber closed his eyes and heard in that sound the quiet certainty of victory, a victory forged not merely by soldiers, but by a nation whose factories and fields moved in unison, crushing empires by the sheer mathematics of abundance. A dry wind rattled the tin roof of the barracks as night settled over Camp Concordia. The day's heat lingered like a heavy blanket, and the smell of wheat chaff still clung to Karl Weber's clothes. He sat on the lower bunk, English primer open, when Franz Müller slammed the door behind him. The sudden clang of metal on wood startled the few men still awake. Müller's face, red from more than the prairie sun, carried a scowl sharpened by weeks of simmering resentment. "You sound like an American now," Müller hissed in German, his voice low but carrying. "Reading their language, laughing at their games. Have you forgotten who you are?" Weber closed the book slowly. He had heard the whispers, accusations of softness, of betrayal. Within the camp's German ranks, pro-Nazi factions still clung to the old ideology, enforcing silence through intimidation. It was not rumor. In other U.S. camps, fanatics had beaten or even murdered those deemed disloyal. He met Müller's glare and felt, for the first time, not fear, but a quiet steadiness. "I have not forgotten," Weber replied, "but I have seen more than the Reich promised." His eyes flicked toward the window, where the lights of the guard towers shone steady against the night. "Do you not hear the trains? Do you not see how they live? We fought for victory, but these people have already won, without even knowing our names." Müller's jaw tightened. He muttered about secret weapons and the coming V-2 rockets, but the words sounded like an old sermon no longer believed. Weber recalled the American radio voice listing impossible numbers. 286,000 aircraft, 2.38 million military trucks, and 2,710 Liberty ships already afloat. These were not rumors. They were arithmetic. No rocket could outrun such mathematics. The barracks fell silent except for the distant hum of a generator. Outside, a freight train's whistle moaned across the prairie, carrying another night's worth of grain toward Atlantic ports. The sound underlined every statistic Weber had heard, each car a moving proof of industrial power beyond the reach of U-boats or Luftwaffe. Evie Carter, making her final perimeter check, sensed the tension, but heard only quiet voices in the dark. She paused beneath the guard tower and listened to the wind slide through the wheat. In that hush, even she could feel the slow collapse of an enemy's certainty. Miller finally turned away, his shoulders sagging. He would not admit defeat, but the set of his back told Weber the argument was lost. As the door creaked shut, Weber looked again at the English words on the page before him. The letters no longer seemed foreign. They were becoming a bridge to a future the Reich could never promise. The Kansas morning broke clear and hot, the sky a hard enamel blue. Weber rode in the back of Jack Thompson's truck, the boards of the flatbed warm under the rising sun. Ahead, the 1944 wheat harvest roared to life. Combines, their engines coughing diesel smoke, rolled across the fields like slow, deliberate armies. Steel headers sliced through the golden stalks, and a haze of chaff sparkled in the light. Jack waved from the driver's seat as they passed the first machine. "Biggest crop we've ever seen," he called over the engine noise. Wartime demand and federal quotas had turned Kansas into a continental breadbasket. Grain elevators, gray concrete towers, rose like sentinels every few miles, ready to swallow millions of bushels. Weber jumped down beside the combine and joined the line of POWs stacking heavy burlap sacks. The work was relentless, the air sweet with cut grain and acrid with diesel fumes. Sweat ran down his back, chaff stuck to his neck like gold dust. Yet the rhythm of labor felt almost peaceful after the chaos of battle. Thompson explained that government allocations ensured fuel for the harvest despite civilian rationing. Even with millions of American men fighting overseas, mechanization kept the crops moving. Weber thought of German farms, where old men and children bent over hand scythes, and he felt the impossible contrast. Here, machines replaced entire regiments of workers, and still the grain kept coming. Over lunch, eaten in the shade of the truck, Thompson shared a scrap of news. American shipyards had now launched more than 2,710 Liberty ships, each carrying over 10,000 tons of cargo. "More steel on the water than the U-boats can sink," he said matter-of-factly. Weber felt the weight of the statement. The harvest he helped gather today might be sailing east in those ships before month's end, feeding Allied soldiers who would march through Europe. As the afternoon wore on, the combines cut ever deeper swaths through the field, the sound a steady mechanical heartbeat. A dust devil spun across the stubble, scattering wheat husks in a shimmering spiral. Weber paused, leaning on his pitchfork, and watched the grain pour from the auger into the waiting truck like a golden waterfall. He realized that this too was a battlefield, not of guns, but of production, where abundance itself decided the war's outcome. Every sack he lifted was another quiet blow against the Reich's shrinking hopes. The prairie wind carried the scent of wheat toward the distant railroad, where trains would bear the harvest to ports and across the Atlantic. In that endless stream of grain, Weber saw the future, unstoppable, democratic, and free. Late afternoon light stretched long shadows across the Kansas plain as thunderheads gathered on the horizon. Carl Weber stood at the edge of the field where he had worked all day, pitchfork resting across his shoulders, the scent of cut wheat thick and sweet in the humid air. The temperature hovered near 90, but it was a damp heat that clung to the skin, nothing like the parched blast furnace of Tunisia where the Afrika Korps had made its last stand. He remembered the sting of blowing sand, the metallic taste of thirst, the endless search for fuel and water. Here the air carried the smell of rain, heavy and imminent. A low rumble rolled across the prairie like distant artillery. Weber watched lightning fork across the far sky and felt a primitive unease. Storms of this scale would have been rare in North Africa, where the desert sun blotted out clouds for months at a time. He thought of the days in May 1943 when German hopes collapsed under the combined weight of Allied firepower and dwindling supplies. The memory of captured panzers and abandoned half-tracks flickered against the darkening clouds. Evie Carter, making her evening perimeter check, stopped to tighten the chin strap of her helmet as the first gusts of wind rattled the guard tower. She recalled her father's stories of the Dust Bowl a decade earlier, skies black with dirt, crops buried in grit. Now the same land yielded record harvests that fed not only America, but entire Allied armies. The U.S. had turned hardship into strength, using machines and sheer determination to transform the Great Plains into a strategic weapon. A freight train's whistle cut through the rising wind. Weber turned and saw its long string of grain cars, glinting in the last light, bound east toward Atlantic ports. Each boxcar was another measure of American might. He remembered the radio voice reciting numbers that still seemed beyond comprehension. Over 2.38 million military trucks, 286,000 aircraft, and a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at Willow Run. These were not boasts. They were the simple facts of industrial democracy, a force as relentless as the gathering storm. Rain began in sudden sheets, drumming on metal roofs and hissing through the wheat stubble. Weber tilted his face upward, letting the warm drops wash away the day's dust. The storm smelled of wet earth and oil from the combines now silent in the field. Lightning flared again, and for a heartbeat the prairie shone like molten silver. He thought of Germany's darkened cities and rationed bread, of the ideology that had promised glory but delivered ruin. The thunder rolled closer, echoing like far-off guns, but here it heralded fertility, not destruction. Weber felt the prairie's quiet message. Power need not be cruel to be irresistible. As the storm settled into a steady rain, he sensed that the world he had known was already gone, washed clean by a nation whose strength lay not in terror, but in abundance. On a bright May morning in 1945, the camp loudspeaker crackled, and a hush fell over Concordia. Prisoners and guards alike gathered near the canteen as the tinny voice of a stateside announcer carried the news. Germany had surrendered. The words drifted across the Kansas prairie like a final gun salute. For Carl Weber, the announcement did not shock. He had heard the verdict in the numbers long before, but still the weight of it settled like a stone. Evie Carter lowered her M1 carbine and removed her cap, eyes fixed on the horizon. She thought of brothers and cousins scattered across Europe and the Pacific, some never to return. The victory bells that rang in nearby towns honored sacrifice as much as triumph. Weber closed his eyes and recalled the impossible arithmetic that had predicted this day. American shipyards had launched 2,710 Liberty ships, each displacing more than 10,000 tons. Factories had turned out 108,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 286,000 aircraft, and more than 2.38 million military trucks. At Willow Run in Michigan, a B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line every 63 minutes, a feat beyond the wildest dreams of German planners. These figures were not abstract. He had seen their consequence in the endless trains of grain, the steady hum of combines, the surplus flour that marked a soccer field. Franz Miller stood apart, his once defiant shoulders slack. He muttered about betrayal, but his voice lacked venom. Even he could no longer deny that the Reich's defeat was not merely military, but mathematical. Weber felt no gloating. Instead, he sensed a quiet respect for the Americans, whose democracy had harnessed industrial power without losing its soul. He remembered the farmers' children sharing chewing gum, the guard who explained English grammar, the sergeant who spoke of Willow Run as if building bombers faster than the enemy could shoot them down were an ordinary day's work. A freight train wailed across the plains, carrying wheat east to the Atlantic, its cars clattering like a victory parade of steel and grain. Weber opened his eyes to the limitless sky and understood that America's strength came from something deeper than weapons, a belief in plenty, in work freely chosen, in a society that could fight total war and still teach its captives. As the loudspeaker clicked off and the prairie wind carried the echo of distant church bells, Weber whispered a single thought, one that would stay with him long after repatriation. The war had been decided not just by courage, but by the steady, implacable mathematics of a free people's industry. The summer of 1945 settled over Kansas in waves of heat and the scent of ripening wheat. The war in Europe was over, and word spread through Camp Concordia that repatriation orders would soon follow. Carl Weber sat beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, near the barbed wire, his English primer balanced on his knee. The pages, once stiff and foreign, now opened easily under his fingers. Nearby, Sergeant Evelyn Carter leaned against the fence post, her M1 carbine slung casually, the formal tension of wartime duty softening in the humid air. Jack Thompson arrived in his battered pickup, bringing a final load of produce for the camp kitchen. He greeted Weber with the easy nod of a neighbor rather than the guarded caution of a farmer once warned about enemy soldiers. The harvest was in, his silos brimming with grain destined for distant ports. He spoke of the coming peace with the matter-of-fact confidence of a man who had already weathered the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. Weber thought of his own homeland, cities in ruins, families waiting for news, the quiet despair of a nation that had followed a false promise. The impossible American numbers he had heard, 2,710 Liberty ships, 286,000 aircraft, 2.38 million military trucks, were no longer merely statistics. They were the visible backbone of a democracy that fed both its armies and its enemies. He had felt that abundance in the cool water Thompson's son once offered, in the flower lines chalked across the soccer field, in the effortless generosity of a society unafraid to share. Muller passed by, shoulders bent, his old defiance extinguished. He no longer spoke of secret weapons or inevitable victory. The ideology that once bound him had dissolved in the face of wheat fields and the low, steady hum of American industry. Weber opened a letter he had written to his family, each line in careful script. These Americans want the same simple things we do: bread on the table, children safe at night, a chance to work and live in peace. He sealed the envelope and pressed the flap tight, the ink still damp like the new hope that stirred in his chest. As twilight deepened, the guard towers glowed like quiet beacons. The prairie breeze carried the murmur of crickets and the distant whistle of another grain train heading east. Weber breathed in the warm, earthy air and understood that the true victory was not simply the end of the Reich, but the beginning of a different kind of alliance, one built on respect and the recognition of shared humanity. Decades later, the Kansas prairie stretched as wide and golden as the day Carl Weber first saw it from a train window. He returned as an old man, invited by the local historical society to mark the anniversary of Camp Concordia's closing. The guard towers were long gone, replaced by quiet fields and a small museum where children stared at photographs of POWs in blue denim marked PW. The smell of cut wheat drifted across the warm afternoon, carrying him back to 1943 when he had arrived a proud but uncertain prisoner. Evelyn Carter, her hair now silver, met him at the museum door. They exchanged a handshake that needed no translation. Time had softened the sharp lines of youth, but not the memories of those tense, revealing years. They walked the grounds together, tracing the outlines of barracks that once housed over 4,000 German prisoners, their conversation mingling the personal and the historical. Weber spoke of the soccer field chalked in flour, of the freight trains carrying grain to Atlantic ports while Liberty ships, 2,710 of them, sailed faster than U-boats could sink them. He recalled the radio voice calmly listing the production of 286,000 aircraft and a B-24 every 63 minutes at Willow Run. These numbers, he told her, had humbled him more completely than any battlefield defeat. They were the arithmetic of freedom, the proof that a democracy, when roused, could outproduce tyranny and yet remain generous even to its enemies. Carter listened, the prairie wind tugging at her coat. She remembered the long night patrols and the quiet pride in a nation that could fight across 2 oceans while still offering education to captured foes. Together they stood where the guard towers once lit the Kansas sky, the setting sun painting the wheat in molten gold. Weber turned to her and said softly, "In Kansas, I realized we Germans and Americans wanted the same simple things: family, work, peace. Your nation showed me that strength can be merciful and still irresistible." As dusk settled, the distant whistle of a freight train floated across the plains, the same sound that had once carried the promise of victory eastward. For Weber, it was now the music of reconciliation, a reminder that the quiet triumph of American abundance had outlasted the noise of war and shaped the democratic world they both now inhabited.